Pause here. Breathe before you continue. God says, I heard the prayers you whispered only in your mind. Not the ones spoken out loud. Not the ones shared with people. But the ones hidden behind forced smiles, late nights, and quiet endurance. This message begins where your strength was tested in silence. Here is the opening truth. God says, you did not imagine the weight, you carried it. There were days you woke up tired before the day even began. Days you held yourself together so others wouldn't worry. Nights when tears fell without sound because you didn't want anyone to hear. I saw all of it. Listen carefully now. God says, your suffering was not ignored, it was measured. Measured for what it was teaching you. Measured for what it was strengthening in you. Measured so it would not destroy you, even when it felt unbearable. Nothing went unnoticed. Here comes the shift, slow and real. God says, the season of silent endurance is closing. Not because you became perfect. Not because you stopped hurting. But because you reached the limit of what you needed to learn from pain. Notice this truth. God says, you were strong longer than you should have been. You held on when letting go would have been easier. You kept faith when answers were delayed. You stayed kind when bitterness would have been justified. That endurance changed something. Now the tone changes. God says, peace does not arrive suddenly, it arrives gently. Do not expect fireworks. Do not expect chaos to flip overnight. Expect relief to enter quietly. Expect your breath to feel lighter. Expect your heart to stop bracing for the next blow. That is how real peace begins. Here is a truth you need to hear. God says, your tears watered what is about to grow. Nothing you cried over was wasted. Nothing you survived was meaningless. The strength you built in private is what allows peace to stay this time. Another layer opens. God says, this new chapter does not demand struggle. You are not required to suffer to deserve stability. You are not required to break to prove faith. Rest is allowed now. Joy is allowed now. Pay attention to this moment. God says, you will notice small mercies first. A calm morning. A clear decision. A conversation that feels safe. A night where sleep comes easily. Do not overlook these signs. They are confirmations. Here is the suspension, hold this gently. God says, the ending of suffering often feels like unfamiliar silence. You may feel strange without chaos. You may feel cautious about calm. Do not rush to fill the quiet. This silence is healing. Final truth of this chapter. God says, I did not bring you this far to abandon you at peace's doorway. You are stepping into a season where your heart rests. Your mind slows. Your soul feels safe again. Comment the word heard. Because it affirms that your silent prayers were seen, counted, and answered. If you want the next chapter, where God reveals how this peace will protect you and what begins changing immediately, type next chapter. Stay here for a moment. This is the day your suffering stops being the main character. Chapter 2, God says, peace will become your new foundation. Stay with this message. This chapter explains how peace begins to work inside your life, not as a feeling, but as a structure. God says, I am not giving you peace as a moment. I am giving it as a ground you can stand on. Here is the first truth you must hear. God says, you will no longer wake up in fight or flight. Your body has been on alert for too long. Expecting problems. Preparing for disappointment. Bracing for loss. Now, that reflex begins to loosen. You may notice your shoulders drop. Your breath deepen. Your thoughts slow. This is not laziness. This is healing. Listen carefully now. God says, peace will reorganize your nervous system before it changes your circumstances. Before things shift outside, your inside must learn safety again. You are relearning what calm feels like. Another shift unfolds quietly. God says, you stop replaying old wounds on repeat. Memories may still arise, but they no longer hijack your emotions. You observe them, and they pass. This is freedom beginning. Notice this internal change. God says, your reactions soften. What once triggered panic now brings pause. What once demanded control now invites trust. This is not weakness. This is regulation. Here is a truth that brings relief. God says, you are no longer required to anticipate pain. You don't need to scan for danger anymore. You don't need to prepare for betrayal. Your intuition will guide you, without fear leading it. Another layer of peace anchors in. God says, your decisions become clearer because your mind is quieter. No more mental noise pulling you in 10 directions. No more exhaustion from overthinking. Clarity grows in calm soil. Pay attention to this moment. God says, you may feel unfamiliar with ease at first. Peace can feel strange. When you've lived in survival, do not rush to recreate chaos. Let ease teach you. Here is the suspension, hold it gently. God says, what feels slow right now is actually stabilizing. Nothing is stuck. Nothing is delayed. Your foundation is setting. Another promise unfolds. God says, from this peace, your next chapter will be built wisely. No rushed decisions. No desperate moves. No emotional bargains. Only aligned steps. Final truth of chapter 2. God says, when peace becomes your base, suffering no longer defines your story. You are not who you were in pain. You are who you are becoming in calm. Comment the word peaceful, because it affirms that you are allowing calm to rebuild you from the inside out. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 3, where God reveals what begins to change around you once peace settles within you. Do not rush. This chapter is doing deep work. Chapter 3, God says, what changes around you will feel quiet, but it will be real. Stay attentive now. This chapter reveals external shifts that don't arrive loudly, but last deeply. God says, when peace settles within you, the world begins responding without announcement. Do not look for drama. Look for alignment. Here is the first truth of this chapter. God says, people will treat you differently because you are no longer asking to be understood. Your energy no longer seeks validation. Your presence no longer negotiates worth. And that changes how others show up. Some will soften. Some will respect you more. Some will quietly step back. All of this is correct. Listen carefully now. God says, you will stop being pulled into situations that drain you. Not because you force boundaries, but because your calm no longer feeds chaos. Arguments lose fuel. Drama loses access. Confusion finds no hook. Peace filters your environment. Another shift begins to unfold. God says, opportunities will align with your capacity, not your desperation. No more rushed decisions. No more pressure-driven yes. What comes now will feel reasonable, sustainable, clear. This is divine timing working quietly. Notice this subtle change. God says, you will be trusted more, without explaining yourself. People sense stability. They sense coherence. Trust follows those who are settled within themselves. Here is a truth many overlook. God says, some doors close not as loss, but as relief. You may feel a quiet thankfulness for things that no longer require your energy. This is discernment maturing. Pay attention to your daily life now. God says, your days feel less heavy, even if nothing dramatic has changed. That is the sign. Your nervous system is no longer bracing. Your mind is no longer racing ahead. Life begins to meet you at a human pace. Another layer settles in. God says, your intuition becomes clearer because fear is no longer loud. You sense when to move. You sense when to wait. You sense when something is not aligned. And you trust that sense. Here is the suspension, hold this gently. God says, the most powerful changes often arrive without applause. Do not doubt the quiet. Do not mistake calm for stagnation. Roots are strengthening. Another promise unfolds now. God says, you will notice protection before prosperity. Missteps avoided. Wrong connections delayed. Decisions clarified at the right moment. This is peace doing its work. Final truth of chapter 3. God says, when your inner world stabilizes, your outer world reorganizes. Not all at once. Not loudly. But permanently. Comment the word alignment. Because it affirms that you trust quiet progress over loud struggle. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 4, where God reveals how your strength will return, without suffering, and how confidence is rebuilt gently, not forcefully. Stay present. This chapter is rearranging your life in ways you don't need to fight. Chapter 4, God says, your strength is returning without pain. Stay with this chapter. This is where many people misunderstand healing. God says, strength does not always return through struggle. Sometimes it returns through gentleness. This chapter explains how your confidence is rebuilt quietly, without forcing, without pressure, and without reopening old wounds. Here is the first truth you must understand. God says, you are not weak, you were exhausted. You were not failing. You were carrying too much for too long. Now that peace has settled, your strength begins to surface naturally. Listen closely. God says, your energy starts coming back in waves, not all at once. Some days you will feel motivated. Some days you will feel slow. Both are correct. Both are part of restoration. Do not rush consistency before capacity returns. Another shift begins here. God says, you stop proving your strength and start trusting it. You no longer feel the need to explain why you deserve rest. Justify your pace. Convince others of your capability. Confidence becomes internal, not performed. Notice this important change. God says, you begin choosing yourself without guilt. You say no without overthinking. You rest without apology. You protect your energy without fear of judgment. This is self-respect being restored. Here is a truth that brings relief. God says, your strength no longer comes from endurance, it comes from alignment. You are not strong because you suffer. You are strong because you listen to yourself now. That kind of strength lasts. Pay attention to how courage returns. God says, you will feel brave enough to try again, but not desperate. You take steps forward without pressure. You explore possibilities without attachment. Curiosity replaces fear. Another layer unfolds gently. God says, your voice becomes clearer. You speak with intention. You don't over-explain. You don't shrink to keep peace. Your words carry calm authority. Here is the suspension, hold it softly. God says, do not compare this strength to your old survival strength. This one is quieter. But it is steadier. And it will not burn you out. Another promise anchors here. God says, you will trust yourself again. Your decisions will feel grounded. Your instincts will feel reliable. Self-doubt loses its grip. Final truth of chapter 4. God says, the strength returning to you is not the one that breaks, it is the one that carries you forward peacefully. You are not becoming hardened. You are becoming whole. Comment the word strong. Because it affirms that your strength is returning in a healthy, sustainable way. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 5, where God reveals how joy re-enters your life slowly, safely, and without fear of loss. Do not rush this phase. Your strength is learning how to stay. Chapter 5, God says, joy is returning, and this time it will stay. Pause. Let this chapter reach you slowly. God says, joy does not rush back after suffering. It walks back carefully, so it does not scare you. This chapter reveals how happiness re-enters your life without overwhelming you, without taking anything away, and without making you fear its loss. Here is the first truth you need to hear. God says, you are allowed to feel good again without waiting for permission. You do not need to earn joy through pain anymore. You do not need to delay happiness until everything is perfect. Joy now arrives as a companion, not a reward. Listen closely. God says, joy will return in ordinary moments first. A quiet laugh. A peaceful meal. A sense of ease while doing nothing special. Do not dismiss these moments. This is how real joy rebuilds trust with your heart. Another shift begins here. God says, you stop fearing that happiness will be taken away. Before, joy made you anxious. Because loss always followed. Now, your nervous system learns that joy can exist without danger following it. This is a deep healing. Notice this important change. God says, you no longer sabotage good moments by overthinking them. You don't ask, how long will this last? What's going to go wrong next? You stay present. You let joy breathe. Here is a truth many people never reach. God says, joy becomes sustainable when you stop clinging to it. You enjoy without gripping. You smile without guarding. Joy stays longer when it is trusted. Pay attention to how your heart responds. God says. Your heart softens without becoming vulnerable to harm. This is not naive happiness. This is grounded joy. You feel light, but still protected. Another layer unfolds gently. God says. Your laughter returns differently. Not loud or forced, but real. Unfiltered. Safe. It surprises you sometimes. That is how you know it's genuine. Here is the suspension, hold this carefully. God says. Joy will test you by asking one thing, will you let me stay? Not by perfection, but by presence. Stay with it. Do not run from it. Another promise anchors here. God says. You will not lose yourself in happiness this time. You remain grounded. You remain aware. You remain whole. Joy adds, it does not erase. Final truth of chapter 5. God says. The joy coming into your life is not temporary relief, it is a new rhythm. A rhythm where peace, strength, and happiness coexist. Comment the word joy. Because it affirms that you are ready to welcome happiness without fear. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 6, where God reveals how your future opens gently, and why you no longer need to worry about losing what is coming. Stay open. Joy is learning how to live with you now. Chapter 6, God says, your future is opening, and you no longer need to fear it. Stay still for a moment. This chapter is about what comes next, and why it will not overwhelm you. God says. The future you once feared is no longer the future approaching you. You are not walking into uncertainty the same way anymore. You are walking into it prepared, protected, and aware. Here is the first truth of this chapter. God says. You are no longer entering the future empty. Before, you walked forward carrying wounds, doubts, and exhaustion. Now, you carry peace, discernment, self-trust. This changes everything. Listen carefully now. God says. You do not need to see the whole path to take the next step. Clarity will arrive as you move, not before. Stop demanding full answers. Start trusting gradual revelation. Another shift unfolds here. God says. Your future is not built on anxiety anymore, it is built on presence. You no longer live 10 steps ahead in your mind. You no longer rehearse worst-case scenarios. You meet life where it is. This keeps you grounded. Notice this deep change. God says. You stop confusing preparation with worry. Preparation feels calm. Worry feels tight. If something pulls peace away, pause. What is aligned will not rush you. Here is a truth meant to settle you. God says. Nothing meant for you will arrive in a way that destroys you. What comes next will fit your capacity. Respect your healing. Honor your boundaries. This is protection, not delay. Pay attention to this internal response. God says. You begin to feel curious about the future instead of afraid. Curiosity means your nervous system feels safe enough to imagine again. This is a powerful sign of recovery. Another layer anchors here. God says. You will be guided more by inner signals than outer pressure. If it feels forced, wait. If it feels steady, proceed. You are learning how guidance actually feels. Here is the suspension, hold it gently. God says. The future will reveal itself quietly, not dramatically. Small openings. Timely conversations. Subtle opportunities. Do not overlook what arrives softly. Another promise unfolds. God says, you will recognize what belongs to you by the peace it carries. Not excitement alone. Not fear-driven desire. Peace will be the confirmation. Final truth of chapter 6. God says, you do not need to control the future when you trust who you are becoming. You are no longer fragile. You are no longer lost. You are ready. Comment the word ready, because it affirms that you trust yourself to meet what's coming. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 7, where God reveals why what's coming will stay, and how to stop fearing loss once and for all. Stay present. The future is no longer something to survive. Chapter 7, God says, what is coming will stay. Stay here. This chapter heals a fear you have carried for a long time, the fear of losing good things once they finally arrive. God says, you learn to expect loss because joy once left without warning. But this chapter exists to close that cycle. Here is the first truth you must hear. God says, you are no longer attracting temporary blessings. Before, good things came while you were still in survival. They arrived when you didn't yet know how to hold them. Now, you are different. You are grounded. You are aware. You are emotionally present. That changes what stays. Listen. God says, what left before was not punishment, it was misalignment. You were still healing. Still learning boundaries. Still discovering self-worth. Some things could not remain without hurting you. Now, your life has structure. Another shift unfolds here. God says, you no longer cling, so nothing needs to escape. You don't grip happiness out of fear. You don't overprotect love out of insecurity. Calm attachment creates permanence. Notice this internal change. God says, you trust stability enough to relax inside it. This is huge. Before, calm made you suspicious. Now, calm feels safe. Your nervous system no longer mistakes peace for danger. Here is a truth that releases old pain. God says, loss taught you discernment, not distrust. You now recognize what drains you, what nourishes you, what feels aligned. That wisdom protects what enters next. Pay attention to how this shows up. God says, you will notice consistency replacing intensity. Less highs and crashes. More steady presence. This is how things last. Another layer settles deeply. God says, what stays now will respect your limits. It will not demand exhaustion. It will not require self-betrayal. It will not thrive on your anxiety. Anything that threatens your peace will lose access quickly. Here is the suspension, hold it softly. God says, the fear of loss fades when you realize you can survive change. You are no longer dependent on outcomes for identity. If something shifts, you remain whole. That knowledge dissolves fear. Another promise anchors here. God says, you are not fragile anymore. You have resilience and discernment now. That combination creates safety. Final truth of chapter 7. God says, what is meant to stay will arrive calmly, and remain without struggle. No chaos. No chasing. No fear-based holding. just presence. Comment the word stable, because it affirms that you are ready for lasting peace, lasting joy, and lasting alignment. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 8, where God reveals how your identity shifts now, and why you will never return to who you were in survival. Stay grounded. This chapter closes the fear of loss for good. Chapter 8, God says, you will never return to who you were in survival. Stay present. This chapter is about identity, the quiet, permanent shift that happens when healing completes its work. God says, you are not becoming a new person. You are returning to who you were before survival took over. This is not transformation through pressure. This is remembrance through peace. Here is the first truth of this chapter. God says, your identity is no longer shaped by what you endured. Pain once defined your decisions. Fear once shaped your priorities. Urgency once ruled your timing. Now, presence defines you. Discernment guides you. Stability grounds you. Listen carefully. God says, you stop introducing yourself through your struggles. You no longer lead with explanations. You no longer feel the need to justify your pace. You no longer bond through pain. Your energy speaks before your story does. Another shift unfolds here. God says, you become someone who expects ease without guilt. Ease no longer feels undeserved. Calm no longer feels suspicious. You accept good without bracing for loss. This is a major identity shift. Notice this subtle but powerful change. God says, you choose from clarity, not from fear. You don't ask, what if I miss out? You ask, what feels aligned? This keeps your life clean. Here is a truth that settles deeply. God says, you stop confusing intensity with meaning. You no longer chase chaos to feel alive. You no longer seek problems to feel useful. Peace becomes enough. Pay attention to how this shows up in relationships. God says, you connect without overgiving. You don't abandon yourself to keep connection. You don't shrink to maintain harmony. Mutual respect becomes your baseline. Another layer anchors now. God says, you trust your rhythm. You move when it's time. You rest when it's time. You wait without anxiety. Your life finds its own pace. Here is the suspension, hold it gently. God says, you may grieve who you were, but you will not want to return. There may be moments of nostalgia. Moments of remembering your old strength. But you will recognize the cost. And you will choose differently. Another promise unfolds. God says, your future self will feel familiar, not forced. You will not feel like you are pretending. You will not feel like you are performing. You will feel like yourself again. Final truth of chapter 8. God says, once peace becomes your identity, survival has no authority over you. You are not going back. You are not repeating cycles. You are not starting over. You are continuing. From a place of wholeness. Comment the word whole. Because it affirms that you accept your healed identity without needing to prove it. Then type next chapter. To receive chapter 9, where God reveals the final confirmation, how you will recognize that this season has truly changed everything. Stay steady. This identity is permanent. Chapter 9, God says, this is how you will know the season has truly changed. Stay with this moment. This chapter gives you confirmation, not hype, clear, grounded signs that the old cycle is finished. God says, you will not need reassurance from outside when the change is real. The proof will live inside you. Here is the first confirmation. God says, your peace will remain even when life is imperfect. Problems may still appear. Delays may still happen. People may still disappoint. But your inner state no longer collapses. That is the sign. Listen carefully now. God says, you stop asking, why is this happening to me? Instead, you ask, what is this teaching me? What is the next calm step? Your perspective has matured. Another confirmation unfolds. God says, you recover faster. Bad days no longer spiral into bad weeks. Discomfort no longer becomes despair. You feel emotions. But you are not ruled by them. This is emotional stability taking root. Notice this powerful change. God says, you no longer feel the urge to go back to what broke you. Even in moments of loneliness. Even when things feel uncertain. The door to old cycles feels closed. Not locked, just irrelevant. Here is a truth many miss. God says, you stop romanticizing survival. You no longer say, I was stronger back then. At least I knew how to handle pain. You recognize the cost now. And you choose peace without guilt. Pay attention to how your intuition responds. God says, you sense misalignment early, and you listen. You don't need chaos to prove something is wrong. A quiet discomfort is enough. You trust yourself sooner. Another layer settles deeply. God says, you begin building, not just coping. You plan with calm. You dream without urgency. You prepare without fear. Your life shifts from reaction to creation. Here is the suspension, hold it gently. God says, you may feel unfamiliar without constant struggle. There may be moments where you wonder, is this really it? Yes. This is stability. Let it feel strange. It will soon feel normal. Another promise anchors here. God says, you will protect this season without fighting for it. Boundaries feel natural now. Self-respect feels automatic. What threatens your peace simply loses access. Final truth of chapter 9. God says, when a season ends for real, you don't crave closure, you live forward. You are doing that now. Quietly. Steadily. Honestly. Comment the word, confirmed. Because it affirms that you recognize the change without needing validation. If you want the final chapter, where God delivers the closing blessing and instruction for carrying this peace into the years ahead, type, final chapter. Stay grounded. This season did not pass through you, it reshaped you. Final chapter, God says, carry this peace forward, and it will multiply. Stay here for a moment. This is not an ending. This is instruction for living. God says, what I have given you is not fragile. It grows when you live from it. This chapter teaches you how to move forward without losing what you've gained, how peace becomes a lifestyle, not a phase. Here is the first instruction. God says, protect your mornings. How you begin your day shapes everything after. Choose. Quiet before noise. Intention before reaction. Presence before urgency. You do not need to rush into the world to prove anything. Listen carefully now. God says, let your decisions be slow enough to include wisdom. You are no longer required to respond immediately. Urgency is not alignment. What is meant for you will wait for your clarity. Another instruction unfolds. God says, speak less about your peace, live more from it. Not everyone needs access to your inner world. Not every listener is a protector. Your life will explain itself. Notice this important reminder. God says, return to your body when your mind gets loud. Breathe. Ground. Pause. Your body now knows safety. Trust it. Here is a truth meant to keep you steady. God says, do not negotiate with what disrupts your calm. You do not need to justify boundaries. You do not need to explain why something no longer fits. Peace is reason enough. Another layer of guidance settles in. God says, choose relationships that feel mutual, not magnetic. Intensity is not intimacy. Consistency is. Let your connections be places you can exhale. Here is the suspension, hold this gently. God says, there will be moments when old patterns try to return. This does not mean failure. It means awareness. Notice. Pause. Choose differently. That is mastery. Another instruction anchors here. God says, let gratitude be quiet and daily. Not forced. Not performative. Simple recognition of what is steady. Gratitude stabilizes peace. Now hear this final promise. God says, what you carry forward with integrity will expand naturally. Peace invites clarity. Clarity invites alignment. Alignment invites growth. Not overnight, but permanently. Final truth of this journey. God says, you are not returning to life as it was. You are entering life as it can be. You are no longer surviving days. You are inhabiting them. You are not chasing meaning. You are living it. Comment the word forward, because it affirms that you are choosing to live from peace, not return to struggle. If this series grounded you, save it. Return to it when life gets loud. This is not a message you outgrow. It is a state you maintain. Stay steady. You are exactly where you need to be. Epilogue, God says, this is how you live from here. Stay with this final extension. Not because something is missing, but because integration takes words too. God says, peace must be practiced, not protected. You don't guard it like something fragile. You live from it like something true. Here is the first integration. God says, let your pace become your signature. You no longer match the speed of anxious people. You no longer rush to keep up with noise. Your calm becomes recognizable. Others will feel it before they understand it. Listen closely now. God says, you are allowed to outgrow urgency. Urgency once kept you alert. Now it keeps you distracted. Move with intention. Respond with clarity. Act when aligned. Another truth settles here. God says, you will notice fewer reactions, and more responses. Reaction is automatic. Response is conscious. This is how peace shows up in action. Pay attention to this shift in self-talk. God says, you speak to yourself with patience now. You don't shame yourself for resting. You don't criticize yourself for slowing down. Your inner voice becomes a place of refuge. Here is a truth that stabilizes everything. God says, you don't need to heal forever. Healing is not your identity anymore. Living is. Some days will be reflective. Some days will be light. All of them are allowed. Another layer deepens. God says, you stop explaining your boundaries. No long stories. No over-justification. A simple no becomes complete. Notice this quiet confidence. God says, you trust silence more than reassurance. You don't need constant confirmation. You don't seek approval to stay grounded. Silence feels full now. Here is the suspension, hold it gently. God says, not everyone will recognize the version of you that no longer struggles. Some will miss the old access. Some will miss the old role you played. Let them. You are not here to be understood by everyone. Another instruction anchors in. God says, return to simplicity when life feels crowded. Eat simply. Speak simply. Choose simply. Simplicity restores clarity. Now hear this lasting promise. God says, what you have learned cannot be unlearned. Even on hard days, you know where to return. Peace is no longer external. It lives inside your choices. Final truth of the epilogue. God says, you are not waiting for life to begin, it already has. There is nothing to prove. Nothing to chase. Nothing to survive.